Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Happy Tuesday, or Wednesday, or Thursday. This is on demand, so you can listen to it whenever you want. My name is Alan Helton, and I am joined today by James Eastham. James, good morning or afternoon or nighttime.
Nighttime. Evening. We'll go evening. We'll go somewhere in the middle between afternoon and evening. Good morning for you, I believe, just about.
It is. Yes, it is Texas morning when we are recording. We are recording this on Monday. This podcast comes out on Tuesdays to talk about you. This podcast is just a reminder, a recap of what you guys talked about, of what we hosted, and what happened in the community from last week. I don't have my calendar in front of me, but I believe last week was September 23rd to the 29th of 2024. So let's roll into it. Before we get into it, let's thank our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Momento. Streaming isn't just about fast loading times anymore, it's about true interactivity. With Momento, you get a real time data platform designed for seamless video streaming that keeps your viewers engaged buffer free. Whether it's live sports, esports, or interactive content, Momento ensures smooth performance and flawless interactivity at any scale. Power your content with Momento, the trusted backbone for next gen streaming. Learn more at gomomento.com. I did two demos last week that we broadcasted in the stream that were highlighting interactivity inside of Momento. I'm actually excited to talk about that in a little bit when we get there.
There's been 7 new members in the last week, taking the total up to 912. We're inching ever closer to the magic 4-figure membership, which will be awesome. So just to quickly welcome this week's new members. We have QWERTY, we have Bart, Shashir, Brando, Brian Jellyfish, Maddox, and Sebastian. Welcome all to the community. We are super excited to learn from everything that you've done, you've got, your experience with serverless or not with serverless, and to hear exactly what you can bring to the community. So thank you for all for joining and tell your friends.
Yes, welcome. Welcome, everybody. So let's roll right into the conversation that we saw while lurking in Discord. I can't actually fairly say lurking. I think you and I probably respond to every conversation that happens inside of that
Mhm.
community. I didn't participate in this one. Oh, no, I did. I lied.
I
I did
missed this one.
participate in this conversation, but we were talking about Temporal Cloud's $200 a month for support. This came from a live stream that Andres and I did where we were comparing step functions with Temporal. So we have that live stream that's out there on the Believe in Serverless YouTube video. And then I also did a summary on my website, Ready Set Cloud, that kind of broke that down into a table format to compare the two directly because they're pretty different from each other, but they're both advanced workflow services. And one of the things that I put in there was that Temporal Cloud costs a minimum of $200 a month for support. Now, that was the caveat in there when they were saying, I'm not going to use Temporal Cloud's $200 a month. I threw out there that's for the managed version, for the hosted version inside of the cloud, and that you absolutely could use Temporal self-hosted for free, just on your hardware that you have up there in the cloud. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. That's the takeaway that I had from this conversation, James, is talking about hosting something yourself versus managed services. What's your opinion on the matter?
I think I don't want to say it. It depends. Let's say it. I don't think. I think that for me, it depends on what does it entail hosting Temporal. I've never worked with Temporal myself, but if to run Temporal, I need to worry about keeping something online or worrying about another piece of my system that could go offline at any moment, at any time, and I'm going to get paged and have to go and worry about it. Versus if I'm paying $200 a month and Temporal Cloud give me some kind of guarantee that thing's always going to be running and I don't need to care about it, then that's where I'd start to make the decision. And if I was working for a larger company and I had an existing set of infrastructure and a team of people to manage it, and we were just deploying container and Temporal into that place, then again, I'd be more inclined to host it myself. But if I don't have the capability. I don't have the capabilities to run instances and things like that. And frankly, I don't care about doing that, which is why we're here talking about serverless. So like that's where I'd start to draw the line is like, what capabilities do your team have? Because I don't know what you think about this, but I expect you could run it yourself for less than $200 a month. I would guess.
Probably. So here's before I get into that, I think my opinion is I probably wouldn't start hosting something stateful specifically for Temporal. Now, this conversation that we're having isn't really just about Temporal, right? This is about
Mhm.
hosting something yourself versus using a managed service. But like for Temporal specifically, I wouldn't put a container out there in the sky that I had to manage for that workflow service. Now, part of that comes with my bias toward I know how to use step functions really well,
Mhm.
and I like that, so it's a little bit easier for me to get off to the races, when it comes to that, so I'd probably is my preference anyway. If I didn't, I still probably would go for the managed version because
Mhm.
I am over managing servers and state. I was gonna say state, I'm not gonna say
Yeah.
servers. I am over managing state of hardware. That was one of the things that I spent a surprising amount of my job as a senior and lead engineer at my last job doing, was going through IIS logs and server logs
Please
and
don't
all
say that.
the
Please don't say them words.
yeah. And it was something that I didn't realize that I didn't like doing at the time, but when I made the switch over to managed services, I realized, "Oh, man, it's nice worrying about app code
Mm,
and
mm,
runtime errors, not so much about hardware errors and state." But there is definitely a tipping point, like that $200 price point for Temporal. I am absolutely not going to pay that for hobby projects. Hobby projects, just by the nature of that word, come out of my dollar, right? That's my wallet that I'm spending whatever I want on, and I'm not gonna do $200 a month for support on. Even if it comes with that guarantee, that SLA of 99.9 or 2 nines of availability, whatever it is, probably still not gonna go for it. But that begs the question I'm gonna turn it over to you. With that in mind, for, like, hobby projects and for just not, like, giant production, where's your tipping points? What would you pay a month for something to be managed?
next to 0. I mean, I say that. We've been living in a world for so long now, right, where if you're building with the typical Lee Gilmore had a really good phrase for this, but, like, the API gateway Lambda DynamoDB API had, like, an acronym like CRUD for it, and I can't remember it. I could probably work it out if I thought about it. The app no, let's not do that. You could run so much stuff in there for nothing, right? Like, you can get a million free invokes in Lambda a month. I can't remember what the DynamoDB free requests are. API gateways like 1 million a month for a year, something like that. So, like, I think it'd have to be pretty low. Like, so for example, for Cloudflare workers, I pay for workers to get access to durable objects, but that's $5 a month. Fine with that. I can deal with that because I get all this cool stuff that I can play with. But it would need to be next to nothing for me to be a hobby project worthwhile, at least, I think.
And so even that, if we talk about that from a conceptual standpoint, if you're not gonna build a hobby project, what are the chances that you would even assess taking the shoes of an enterprise architect whose responsibility is going out and assessing, like, giving fair assessments for different vendors that satisfy the same type of business requirement?
Yeah.
What would you do in that situation? You can't try it out for free,
Yeah.
so is that even on your list? Because $200 a month for an enterprise or anything that's actually hitting production that needs a managed workflow service, that's really not that bad, taking
No.
out the scope of hobby projects. But what does that interfere with you as an architect who is doing that due diligence?
I think I'd come back to kind of like my original answer. I'd come back to the cross section between what does the thing need to do. For example, if the temporal cloud only supported, I don't know, 1 million invokes a month, and it doesn't. I don't know that to be clear for anybody listening, but let's just imagine it did in a theoretical world. Then I had 2 million invokes a month, so I'd consider both the technical aspect of it, but also what capabilities does this fictional enterprise organization I work for? Because if theoretical enterprise organization been first from the ground up now, and they have infrastructure people. They don't have places to run this infrastructure to run Temporal. It is going to cost you a lot more than even 10x $200 a month to be able to pull a team in to be able to run infrastructure internally, right? So that would be where you could get into conversations. I don't know what the temporal billing model is, but for any SaaS provider, you get into a conversation about, do you have enterprise licensing? Can this go higher? Can this go lower? So I think it's got to be the cross section between the technical requirements and what capabilities does my organization have. I often think it's something that gets missed in conversations about serverless. I've worked with customers in the past who've looked at like the line item price of $200 a month, or the line item price of Lambda's X number for X number of invokes. And it forgets about this whole other OpEx of, yeah, but you need a team of 100 people to run a Kubernetes cluster, right? I feel like that gets missed a lot. And I think this is almost one of them same conversations. Like, it isn't as simple as just $200 versus nothing, host it yourself, because then you need a team of people who will cost more than $200 a month guaranteed.
Love it. I'm going to put that one to bed right there because I think that's a really good ending note on that conversation. That's like drop mic, walk off stage kind of moment. So let's shift a little bit from that and let's talk about a completely different topic, sending updates in asynchronous workflows. This was a conversation that was happening on Sunday, and Gary brought up a question of how to notify a user when image processing is done. So the business process that he had was his front end was uploading a an object into S3. He called a Lambda function. It returned a pre-signed URL, and then he uploaded the image to that pre-signed URL, hit the bucket. And then there was the classic EventBridge events from
Mhm.
an object being added inside of S3, and that triggered a Lambda function. So his question was, how do I let that person that uploaded that file know that the image processing is done? Basically, this was an async. What do I do now? Which is it's a fantastic question at any scope, like any amount of experience, but it's a really good question to have when you're just getting into asynchronous programming. It's how do I let them know? What do I do now? And so before we go into how I explain that to Gary, I would like to hear from you, James. Like, what comes to your mind in a workflow like that? Like, how would you let a user know that's still on a web page when something is done
See,
asynchronously?
your important distinction then has just ruined what I was going to say. The user on a web.
It's still on the web page?
Yeah, yes, because I think like I don't know. I think I've tried to build like WebSockets and real time notification stuff in the past, and that's certainly got a lot easier. And I'll come on to that. But actually, I think when it comes to user notifications, like good old fashioned email is likely to be a lot simpler to implement, and most people have got email addresses now, right? So if you're a user, your user is logged in the same way. If you ever made a payment on Amazon and your payments fail, when you check out on Amazon, you'll get a yay, well done, you've bought something. And then 5 minutes later, you get an email saying, hey, sorry, your payments failed. Now, so I think in terms of simplicity, I think email's a really neat solution to things like this because it's still widely used. People still have a lot of questions. But you said they're still on the web page, Alan. So
Well, here
thanks for that.
before I add that requirement, there's a whole segment of real-time notification use cases where the asynchronous workload being processed only takes a few seconds. If you think about what he's doing, let's just say he's downscaling and converting the image and maybe running it through some detection to make sure it's not an inappropriate image.
Yep.
All those things put together take 2 seconds at most. That's like P999 latency, 2 seconds. So realistically, something that's gonna take 2 to 5 seconds, to me, an email is overkill. I would not like to do that because in 5 seconds, I'm definitely not going to have clicked that X on my browser and
Yep.
navigate away from the page. There's a certain cutoff where the email is, yes, absolutely appropriate, but there's also before that cutoff, it makes more sense to keep it in the browser or really whatever application, right? It doesn't have to be a web app. It could be a thick client inside of that user experience that triggered that workflow.
Yep. Yeah. And that's where you're getting into the world of WebSockets, right? The real time bi directional communication type stuff. Coming from a .NET background for me, we're a little bit blessed. I've always thought in the .NET ecosystem. So there's something in the .NET ecosystem called Signal R, and it's like bidirectional. WebSockets is just built in. It's just built in. You start up an ASP.NET app. It's not as simple as add SignalR, but add SignalR. You create a hub. They call it a hub, and then you've just got SignalR. And Microsoft have got clients for JavaScript, for Java, for Python, for all these different languages. So there's a little bit of a blessing in the .NET world because it's something Microsoft support as a first class citizen, and it's really easy to add it. There's no jumping through hoops. Of course, to do that, you need to be running container somewhere, which people don't always want to do.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
a lot of the joy I've been having with Cloudflare recently, actually, is with Cloudflare durable objects. It's one of the things in Cloudflare that's pretty unique to any other thing I've ever built with anywhere, and that just has WebSockets built in. Imagine you've got a user durable object. You can just say me dot connections, get a list of all the connections, for each over all the connections. It's like 3 lines of code to do WebSockets, and everything is just managed behind the scenes by Cloudflare. Like it's a brilliant developer experience. To compare that to trying to do it on AWS using API gateway, WebSockets, crazy Lambda functions everywhere, AppSync is an option, but I've always found when you need to start putting lots of pieces together, it just gets really complicated, which is then I think maybe where my email answer comes from is being burned in the past from doing things with API gateway and WebSockets and Lambda and it just being hard to do and process, whereas email's just easy. You just send an email. But there's a whole bunch of providers out there now, like Memento. I think Memento Topics can do this kind of thing, right? That is, if I was doing it now, to answer your question more succinctly, because now I'm rambling, is I would look for a service like a Cloudflare durable objects, like a Memento, where I can just be like, I want real time communication and I don't care how it works. I just want to be able to do it easily. I want to send a message to a topic and that goes to a front end, or I want to load an instance of a durable object, Alan's durable object, and I want to send a message to everybody connected to Alan. And then that just happens. And I don't want to care about the rest. So, rambling answer.
Yep. Nope. It's good. You said a few things that triggered me, and I realized that in my tenure at Momento, where I learned a whole lot about how real time notifications work, since we have a service for that, there's a lot of, I don't necessarily want to say misinformation, but I guess it's assumptions and just a lack of understanding around the broader, like what real time notification, real time data processing actually is, just is
Mhm.
in a whole. And that was why I joined this conversation in Discord in the first place, because they were talking about WebSockets and server sent events and what the pros and cons were of each of them, because they were both, it was Omid and Gary that were talking. They were saying, I can't use server send events. First, one of them had never heard of server send events, which is totally fine. That's not a very common protocol. But they were like, I need something that's duplex. And I think WebSockets is the way to go. So I jump in and I'm like, no, you don't. Not in this case. All you're trying to do is you're trying to get information from the server to the browser, which is one way. Duplex means two-way,
Mhm.
and you don't need to be sending messages from the client back up to
Mhm.
the server in this connection that's been established via a WebSocket. Server sent events is a good option as far as messaging protocols for something like that, because it is a one way. It is a one way server to client push. Basically, the client does a get. It's literally an HTTP get, and that connection is left open,
Mhm.
and the server can push text, specifically only text, over that open connection whenever it wants until the connection is terminated. Back to answering the question that Gary had originally posed, how do you do it? If you were strictly trying to do an AWS workflow, you already said two of the three options. You can use API Gateway. They have a native WebSocket option inside of API Gateway where you have to manage the connections and what each connection cares about and expiring the connections and reconnecting and all that stuff. Very low level, but it is good. You have AppSync, which is more of a managed WebSocket connection that does send updates on specific events. The drawback with that one is that you have to use GraphQL to do it. Not everybody uses that, so that's more of a niche. And then the other one is IoT Core, which is again a different protocol. It uses MQTT, which is typically what IoT devices. So different protocols there. But as far as like actually implementing that type of a workflow, what you would do, and the part that I think Gary was missing initially, is when you're uploading that document, hopefully along the way, either in the negotiation to get that pre-signed URL or in the response, you're getting an ID back that's going to represent that instance of the workflow.
Mhm.
And as soon as you upload or basically trigger that workflow, you will then subscribe via whatever mechanism that you're going to get real time notifications on with that identifier. And that identifier is going to follow that workflow through its life, right?
Yeah.
That's the stamp, that's the instance. So that's what you do in a situation like that where you're kicking off an asynchronous workflow and you want to get that update back to the user who's still actively engaged.
I suppose there's one other option here, right? Which is just polling. As in, if you're in a
Polling,
scenario
yeah.
where if you're in a scenario where you know that 99.9% of the time it'll be done in 2 seconds, then get the identifier back and don't worry about any of this messy connection setup, MQTT, whatever it is,
Mhm.
just make another HTTP call. Just expose another API endpoint to make a get. In your front end, you could wait, set timeout, is it in JavaScript, where you can wait for a period of time
Mhm.
and then just send a request and just run that on a loop. If we I don't know. Simplicity is nice. I like simplicity.
Yes, it is. And that's actually spoiler alert for here in a minute. That's one of the clips that we're going to be listening to today
Ooh, nice.
is the differences in types of push notifications.
Ah, nice.
So to wrap this one up, my official recommendation was just use Memento topics because it does. My biased opinion is use Memento topics because it abstracts away all the connection management and it fully integrates with EventBridge. So you can just do an EventBridge, put events, and it will push that notification down to the browser for you automatically, which
I
is
think
super
much
nice.
like our first conversation with Temporal, that, and it's not Temporal, it's about managing stateless or state. This is
Mm,
don't use something where you need to manage everything. There's a
yeah.
tool out there where you can not worry about any of this low level stuff and you just get push notifications and it just works. Use that one.
Yes.
Just use that one. Just do that.
Yes. Totally. I touched a little bit on using an identifier to track an asynchronous workflow through its life. And that brings me to a topic that you started in the Discord last week where you were building something, I think, that was like tracing event workflows. I don't know exactly what it was. It looked cool in the screenshot that you had, but you obviously know more about it than I do. So let me just hand it over to you on this one.
Yeah. So my idea with this, and I have to give full props to Tolly, whose second name I'm not going to try and pronounce. Sorry, Tolly, who's in our Discord community. He's a big advocate in the world of observability. He's a Datadog ambassador. And this is a conversation we had at the AWS Community Summit last week. And we were talking about how in an event-driven architecture, you're gonna have a set of events that all relate to the same thing. So imagine your typical e-commerce website. You've got order created, order confirmed, order payment completed, payment confirmed, whatever. You've got all these events that relate to a given thing. And the typical way you'd look at that from like an observability or a visualization standpoint is you'd look at the individual service. So how does this service do some work to produce the order confirmed event? But actually, because you've got all these events that are just flying around, I think there's a missed opportunity. Why can't we start to visualize how all the events related to a given entity flow around? So rather than looking at here's the technical service things that happened inside a service, how do all the events for a given order link together? Basically, how can you visualize all of the events that might be happening days, weeks, months apart? So then I started building out a little proof of concept to basically the kind of low level of it is just create a catch-all rule on EventBridge and then grab some kind of common identifier inside your event payload. So this assumes that every event you ever publish has got an order ID property, for example, or a user ID or a customer ID or whatever. And then you can just pull out that ID and just add that to a trace. So you just end up with one big long trace in the typical distributed tracing sense. But inside the trace, you've got all these points of this is when an order created event happened. This is when an order confirmed event happened. Oh, and then a payment cancelled happened. And then you can start to link them traces back to the actual technical traces. And it gives you this really, I think what will be a really valuable, both for a developer to understand if you've been through something like event storming or you've done some documentation for how your system should work. Frankly, I think if you could build a system that is self-documenting, if your system can document itself, if your system can tell you how it's functioning, you can compare that directly to how you think your system is functioning. And this is what I was trying to get to, is how can you start to actually visualize business workflows through the actual events that are flying around? And then an observability backend is the logical place to put them.
So you're not the only one that's had this idea. I do know that because what you're describing sounds like a subset of what David Boyne's event catalog does.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I was talking to Dave about this last week as well, because event catalog at the minute, you have to upload specification files, but they're in the progress. He might have released EventBridge this week, I'm not sure. But to actually plug into actual Kafka EventBridge, Azure, Event Grid, or whatever it's called on Azure. So yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, what Dave's doing is awesome.
And then I also think that is similar to at least one of the goals that Boris Tane had with Baseline. Baseline was acquired by Cloudflare. So I think that is actively going into that Cloudflare ecosystem is that distributed trace
Mhm.
across everything to see what is the workflow.
Yeah. And I think the key thing is, at least for me, is to be able to link that to, because you're looking at two different things. You're visualizing the flow of events for a given thing, a given business thing. That's not going to be useful when your page is going off at 3 in the morning and you've got a tier 0 issue, right? That's a different type of observability data. But being able to link the two together directly, so I can look at, okay, here's a business workflow, and then I can almost double click down and see what actually happened at a technical level to make this event happen, and then zoom back out. Okay, what happened after the already confirmed event? Oh, a payment failed. Double click, zoom in. Ah, that's why it failed, because of something that happened upstream. And that's where I think what Dave is doing is awesome, but Event Catalog isn't
Mhm.
an observability product, right? That is a
Yeah.
visualization tool, which is awesome. It's a documentation tool, awesome. And maybe that's what
Mhm.
Cloudflare are going to do. We'll see.
I hope so. That'd be awesome. Like for years, we've been talking about like this exact problem being one of the hardest problems in distributed programming and serverless in general. Like figuring out end to end what is your event driven workflow for a given entity, being
Hmm.
able to trace from start to finish with all the hops in there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a hard problem.
I'm excited for that. Yeah, I'm excited for it to be solved. I remember having meetings at my last job where we would just sit there in the room and be like, "How do we figure out when something goes wrong?" And just not ever leaving those meetings with a good answer.
Yeah, and it's the cause and effect problem, isn't it? When you've got everything happening asynchronously, it's the thing I struggled with when I first stopped building .NET Framework monoliths and started and saw the light and started building a better way. It's the hardest thing to wrap your head around is I'm building a monolith and deploying it to a single Windows server, and the server goes down. I know what the problem is. The server's down. Yeah, easy. Whereas
Yeah.
when you start, it's a complexity problem, isn't it? I don't think serverless event-driven architectures are any less complex than monolithic systems. It's just a different type of complexity. You just shift the complexity around. I don't know if it's Boris who said this actually. Maybe it's Jan Chewy, but serverless event-driven systems just make complexity visualize. They allow you to visualize the complexity, because the complexity of these systems is there. It's just tucked away in a nice little black monolithic box that's just nice and you can't see inside it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like when I was a kid and my mom told me to clean up my room, and I would just take everything and shove it into my closet, then close the door and go get my mom and say, "Look at how clean my room is." And she would ask me, "Where's the stuff?" And I'd say, "I don't know." Then I'd open the door and it all just comes crashing out. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
not a mess,
I
which
love the
is,
answer is I don't know. I don't know where it went.
okay. Let's move on to another conversation that you started, James, and that's cores. Everybody's favorite. I'm surprised you didn't roll your eyes at me when I said that, honestly.
I can't believe you're making me relive this, if I'm totally honest. I'm tempted just to go and sit downstairs for a minute and let you have this, and then I'll come back. You're making me relive this, and I don't like it.
But we don't have to talk about it very long. Like, we can
Okay,
definitely reach the
do that.
conclusion that cores is hard, but it's intentionally difficult,
Mm,
right?
mm.
Like you're saving yourself by not letting other browsers call your APIs. But you had an issue specifically trying to implement cores, or I think that's what you had. You're having cores issues with an HTTP API
Correct.
you were building.
Yeah. Yeah, so seemingly in the CDK, when you create a HTTP API, there's actually a property in the CDK in the options where you can say enable cores. Like, it seemingly is stupidly simple. You just enable cores and you specify the origins and the methods and all the stuff that you want, all the settings. And theoretically, you would think that would just work, wouldn't you, Alan?
Yeah. Yes, I would.
But it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It seemed to be that the options methods weren't getting added. So when I compare this to what happens with a REST API gateway, REST API, the setting is almost identical. It's just enable cores and then you specify all your defaults. But when you do that inside the console, you see all the options endpoints just automatically appear inside the console. And if you add a new route to that API, the options endpoint automatically gets added. That wasn't happening with the HTTP API as far as I could see. And frankly, I don't know why. And your point about security is an interesting one because all I do is just do stars everywhere because that's all I can do to make it work. So, security
Uh,
people, shut your ears. I wouldn't do that in the real world. But yeah, but that's what I do normally. Is I'm just like star, star, star. Give me it all.
yeah. That was one of the freeing moments when I moved over to developer advocacy versus what I was doing with the government software was I don't write production software anymore, and it's more okay. I can't say that it's okay, but it's less bad now that I can make demos that are just public
I think as long as
or
you acknowledge it, right? Like, I think in the
Mhm.
sample I was building, I put a comment in there because it's a sample that I'm building for Datadog for work. And I put a comment in there saying, don't do this in production in the README. Don't do this in production. So I think as long as you acknowledge it in our kind of world, then I think it's okay.
Yeah,
But it was
it's a
really
balance
awesome.
because a lot of
I will
times
say it was really awesome. There was you. Who else? There was three of us jumped on a live
yeah,
discussion inside the Discord.
Andrew
Andrew,
Robinson.
Andrew, that was it.
Yes, used to work
Sorry.
with me. He was on my team. He was the guy that I would always point at hard problems and say, "Hey, can you fix this for me, please?" And he would in, like, ridiculously short amounts of
That's a
time.
good friend to have. So yeah, that was really cool. Just for all of you, just to dive on. We had a little live debugging session. It's a shame the answer
Yes.
was just use a different thing, but there we go.
Yes. So I wanted to talk about that just for a second before we move on to recapping the live streams from last week. Is I really liked that session. You and I were talking in Discord. It was in, I don't know, API channel. You're having a problem. I was available. You were available. So we just decided, let's just go hop on the live chat, the stage, I think is what it's called, live discussions, and go talk about it. And we did. Several people hopped on with us, and it was just a fun little community thing where we could do the collective hive minds of let's troubleshoot your problem. And I want to do more of that.
Yeah.
That's something we got really good feedback from it after we did it. People were saying you should do that more often. And I think we should. So I'm going to pose this out here just conceptually for now. I think it would be fun to do on a recurring basis, like a weekly thing, where one day, doesn't have to be any specific day at this point, but one day we just go in and do tech talks, or not even a talk, but like tech water cooler. We'll just say that, where people could say, I have this problem, I don't, or I built this cool thing. And we just go in and just have anyone can just pop in, pop out, and share or help at will. What do you think about that idea, just conceptually, James?
Conceptually, I think it's awesome. Like the more, I think it's one of the things at least I miss about remote work versus being in office work. I love being remote. I love it. It's like it's so good for general life and being able to do things and get things done. But that exactly that, almost like the nerding out is what I'd call it. So I'd be all. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Let's do that. Let's do it. For anybody listening, give us a shout. Weigh in. Do you want to do that? Do you not want to do that? I think it's a good idea, bad idea. Let us know.
Mhm.
Okay, James, do you know how many sessions we had last week?
Can I give the answer of before we start recording, which is I can't count, which is I think five, but I can't count to six seemingly. So let me guess six.
Yeah. That's 6. We had 6 sessions last week,
That must be a record.
all throughout the week. I think we had one every day. We had a session every single day last week, and then we doubled up on Thursday, I believe it was, which is amazing. I think that ties our record for most sessions in a single week. Great content too. It's not like we're just putting anything out there unprepared and just going out and winging it 6 times a week. These are like legitimate industry leaders that have these things that are, fully ready to go to talk about things that are meaningful and close to them. So, super happy with everything. We are very close. I manage our YouTube channel and we are very close to 100 videos on there already just from this year, which is
That's crazy.
amazing. Yeah. Let's just jump in and listen to a clip. The first one from the week, this was from Monday. This was a session between Quadra Shams and Jeremy Edberg about the history of Lambda. And I picked this clip specifically from here because they weren't talking about the history of Lambda here, but they were talking about the problem with modern compute. And I just found it very fascinating and thought provoking. So let's listen to it real quick.
Keep the database dumb, keep the application smart, and keep a separation of concerns. But that is what is causing a lot of our problems. I think we went too far into separation of concerns. And the reason we did it is because it was hard to debug stored procedures. Nobody likes stored procedures because they're hard to debug, especially in a distributed environment. But what we've done is we've made that so easy because you don't have to even write those procedures. We have our open source framework that just lets you test it locally. And so what we've essentially done is abstract all of that away. I really do think that is what is going to solve a lot of the emergent problems that we have seen with serverless compute in the last 10 years.
Okay, so he's talking like what he's talking about there at the end is that's Jeremy talking, his company. He's CEO of DBOS, which is very cool. I was trying to think of the right way to to describe it. So I'm just going to describe it as very cool and do watch that whole show. But man, he was on point with it sucks debugging stored procedures. I know you have a extensive Microsoft background, James, so I know you feel that too.
I've written the stored procedures that are hard to debug, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And then regretted it about 6 months later when I had to debug the thing I'd just written. So yeah. Yeah. The first thing I thought when I first heard that clip was stored procedures, and then he went and said it.
Yes. So I like what he's talking about conceptually here. I haven't used DBOS, but I'm tempted to. One of the things that I like about it is he's saying we're basically shaking things up, which is another way of saying we've innovated and I'm being humble about it. And he's blurring those lines of compute and storage. Now, initially you think that and you're like, no, it needs to be separated, but you start maybe in one of those beer conversations we were just talking about. Does it? Does
Mhm.
it need to be
Mhm.
anymore? There's so many abstractions on top of so many things these days. It makes sense to have that abstraction sitting in there for you.
Yeah. And when I think about this is reminds me a lot of some of the stuff that Cloudflare have announced last week with the durable objects. So now you can attach like a full SQLite database to your durable object, which is the same idea where you can have your compute live next to its actual data storage, like in the same node, same memory space, however you want to call it, and run that on the edge everywhere. So you've got your compute and your database sat right next to each other, right next to the user that's going to access that specific thing of things. It sounds like I've not used DevOps either, but it sounds like a very similar idea to what the Cloudflare folks are doing as well in terms of yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Like you said, like the putting compute next to database immediately makes me just shiver. Like I think of running a database on the same server as my 3-tier web app, and it gives me nightmares the idea of doing that. But yeah, maybe we're in a world where that's possible now.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about that, you have to read in between the lines for it. Doing that gives you unprecedented speed. There's no
Mm,
network traffic when
mhm.
they're right there next to each other. It's there.
Yeah,
So I think we're going to see a huge uptick in performance if we start accepting that as a construct in modern programming.
yeah, agreed.
All right, so this month, actually, by the time this airs, it's going to be October. So last month was data month, and we were talking about all the different types of data. So last week we had Anais Dotis on the show to talk about time series databases, and she works at InfluxDB. So let's talk or let's listen in while she describes the problems that InfluxDB had to solve with a scalable serverless time series database.
One benefit to using MQTT is that we can connect hundreds of thousands of devices all at the same time and write those to different topics in parallel. A time series database has to be able to accommodate that type of throughput. The other thing that we need to think about is efficient queries, because if we can accommodate a really high write throughput, but we aren't able to query effectively and efficiently, then that doesn't really do us much good. So we need to perform aggregations over time. We need to be able to accommodate for really fast scans over the data as well. It's very common, especially in IoT use cases where you're looking at global minimum and maximum values. And so that means that you need to be able to scan across all of your data all at one time to get those.
I
time
hear the
series
word
database
scan
is
and I
really messing
immediately
with my
think of
head.
DynamoDB scan, and that sounds horribly inefficient.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Do you ever do a database scan? No.
Oh, never.
But apparently that's a thing. That is like the concept, what you do to get aggregates in
Mm.
time series data.
Mhm.
I really liked that talk because basically her whole session was walking through a use case. And it was a use case that I don't really know a whole lot about, but find interesting. It was like robotic arms inside of factories. And conceptually, that sounds cool. It still sounds sci-fi to me, even though it's been around for so long. She was talking about like how do you find anomalies? How do you know when robotic arms need work? What do you do when they malfunction? And you could do all that with time series data.
Yeah, it's an area I'm really not particularly familiar with, like time seriesy type stuff, like in terms of the specifics of it. It sounds like a hard problem to solve. That specifically, that okay, you've got all, especially with IoT devices, there are typically lots and lots of them, right? Like you've got lots and lots of little things all sending data, and then you want to run a scan. You want to see over an entire data set, aggregate in a given time period what are anomalies, what are like that. Seems like a really difficult problem technically to try and do in an efficient way. Like she was saying, you get really high write throughput, great, but if you can't read it, then that's not so useful. And equally, the opposite is also bad because if you can read it really fast, but you can't deal with this incoming load, then you're also in a problem. So yeah, seems
Yep.
interesting.
Yep. Yeah. It's one thing to collect the data. It's another thing entirely to use it.
Absolutely.
And that perfectly segues. I didn't even practice this. Perfectly segues into the next session that we had last week, which was talking about business insights using Amazon Q and QuickSight. It was a talk from AWS hero Wendy Wong, and she was talking about gathering business insights from vast amounts of data using natural language. So she had a really cool example here in this clip.
You can ask a simple question in Q. Just say you're the dean of an education institution. You want to understand your data, but you're not a data person. So let's ask a really simple question using natural language. We can ask which country most of my students from, because perhaps you have some international students and you want to find out the composition. So we'll tell you, yep, most of my students are from United States. And then also tell you the unique number. And then based on their home origin, let's expand this visual as well. So you see the highest enrollments were from the United States, and there was a peak around April this year as well.
So this is like the opposite end of what Anais was talking about with InfluxDB, where it's actually making meaningful use of vast amounts of data. And that's one of the problems that I have. And I'm actually really curious to hear from you as well. It's like I collect data in basically all of the projects that I do. I build automations all the time. And I always collect data on what the state of things are. And I just shove it in the database and I literally never know what to do with it. I don't know what metrics to capture. And even if I did, I wouldn't know how to action from those metrics. So using something like QuickSight and Q to be able to just say, what do I do with this information? Or when is the best time for me to host live streams for Believe in Serverless based on the amount of people that watched it? Or what are the topics that people really respond well to is a game changer. It's provides actionable, real, tangible things with that data that you've collected.
Yeah, 100%. It's something I do. I think it's one of the really good use cases I can see for generative AI is this kind of summarization. Like all my, to your point about collecting stuff, I collect a lot of stuff like snippets, conversations with people, and they all just go in Notion. I've used Notion for years just to collect. I have a whole process. It's called Zettelkasten and Google it. But there's a whole process about collecting and making notes. It's a thing. Let's not go into that. It's not for today's podcast. But last year, 18 months ago or so, Notion added AI to Notion. So you can now ask questions across your entire Notion. So this catalog of little snippets of data, little bits of information that I've been collecting over maybe 3 or 4 years now, suddenly I can just ask questions of all of these things that I've been thinking about. And the talk I gave last week at the conference on observability in asynchronous world, like the seed of that talk was me asking questions of my own Notion database to try and pull together everything I'd ever written down about observability, every book I'd ever read, every video I've ever watched about observability and pulling all that together. So although that's not like business insights and metrics and data, I still think that is one of the use cases where I get a lot of value from AI is that I've got all this unstructured stuff and I want to try and make sense of it, understand it, pick through it, get the right bit of information from the right place. So, yeah, for once, I can't remember if I'm saying this, it's something that's recorded, but I think this is actually a really good use case for AI and Q and QuickSight and things like that. Seems a good spot for it.
Totally. It brings an air of data science to app builders. A lot of
Mm.
app builders aren't
Mm.
data scientists, and just having a tool at your disposal that gets you into that world is insanely valuable. All right, let's keep rolling. We had another session. I did a session with Michael Gash, a PM from the EventBridge team over at AWS, and we were talking about API destinations. So here's him giving a fast 1-minute summary of what API destinations are.
API destinations is a feature that integrates with HTTPS-based APIs. Often we call them webhooks. And recently, we added Momento as a API destination partner integration. In general, API destinations can target any HTTP endpoint, but these partner integrations make it easier for you to set this up. API destinations is fully cloud events compliant. So if you have a HTTP server that requires cloud events, API destinations can transform events basically. And digging a little bit deeper into API destinations, it consists of two components, the connection and the API destinations. The connection is the way to express authorization that allows you to specify basic username password. We have OAuth support or just token API key. We offer integrated error handling with API destinations. So we have retries. By default, they're retried up to 24 hours or 185 times. Which one hits first, but you can configure and completely disable retries if you want to. If retries are exhausted, we have the option to specify that ladder queue.
There's so many features of EventBridge that people are just sleeping on, right? Like, there's so much in there that's just not an event bus.
Yes. And I said that to Michael at the very beginning of that session. And he said, think of EventBridge almost as a framework rather than a service.
Mm.
It has the scheduler, it has buses, it has rules, it has pipes, it has destinations, it has connections. Connections are used natively inside of step functions as well for HTTP invocations. It's a whole thing. It is fully engrossed in that AWS ecosystem. It's hard to build anything in AWS these days without using EventBridge.
Yeah. And that particularly with the third-party support, with things like Memento, going back to the earlier conversation about sending notifications back to a front end. If I can publish an event to EventBridge, that then hits a Memento topic that then automatically goes back to my front end with zero effort from me. I just publish an event and down the pipe to the front end, then that seems like a fantastic developer experience as well as being functionally fantastic.
Yeah, it feels like magic, honestly, with stuff like that. I've used EventBridge API destinations, obviously with Momento, with Stripe as well. They have really deep integration with Stripe, and they partner with a bunch of different vendors as well. So there's a lot of partner integrations. That doesn't have to be a partner to integrate with API destinations, but if they are, they provide quick starts of getting that going. Highly recommend API destinations. If you watch that one, I do a demo in that session that shows every way to, to interact with a connection and an API destination, which is 3 ways: via a pipe, via a rule. So if you do put events with a rule, and then also inside of step functions, an HTTP invoke uses the EventBridge connection. Tried to get as exhaustive as I could with that. Okay, we have 2 more clips to go over, James. Let's rock. So this next one, again, last month was data month. So I asked Philip Kren from Elastic to come in and talk about the work that they've been doing on Elasticsearch Serverless. Not OpenSearch from Amazon. This is from Elastic itself getting into that serverless game. So this clip is him talking about the service itself and how using the serverless flavor of it is simplifying architectures.
For indexing, how that works, the write goes to the indexing tier, but will be immediately written to that transaction log on S3. And eventually the final data structure will be written in an index store. There is no searching on this tier. So all the data gets written here. And you have a dedicated search tier that handles all the searches from the index data structure. It is a much cleaner architecture. You don't need all of these tiers and everything talks to everything. It's more nicely separated. The other nice attribute of this is that you can independently scale indexing and searching. If you suddenly have a burst in write operations, you will just need to scale up that indexing tier to keep up with those write operations. But your search tier is unaffected by that. The new architecture has much more intelligent auto-scaling, so it will do all of that for you.
I love it. I love everything about that. If you're
Mm.
only listening to this podcast, I do recommend going and watching that one. That one is worth the look because he has on the screen an architecture diagram of what traditional Elasticsearch looks like. And the serverless version, it is way
Mhm.
simpler. Separation of concerns against that first clip we were listening to. But it comes with the benefits of separation of concerns where you can independently scale your reads and your writes.
And I think this is, it reminds me of the Neon when we moved from Neon on, where that's a similar kind of thing where they separate the compute and the data, and that's what allows them to be smarter with their auto scaling. So different separation of concerns to this one, but that's what gives you that dynamic ability to scale exactly where you need to and scale down again if you don't need to. So yeah, that's going to be a lot of workloads, right? A lot of workloads are going to have lots of writes and not many reads, or lots of reads and not many writes. There's not many workloads, at least I've worked on, that are stupidly high in both domains. Most I've ever worked on, at least, have either been write heavy or read heavy.
Yep.
So the fact you can independently say, I want more reads and my writes are fine, is really cool.
Yeah, but I like the fact that you can just let it do its thing and it'll take care of the scaling for you
Yeah.
automatically. I'm not an expert in auto scaling, so I will leave that to the people who are. Okay, and last thing I'll say on Elasticsearch, that's not GA yet. It is still undergoing work, and they're also still going under some business requirements, especially around things like pricing. When Andres and I did a session testing out Elasticsearch Serverless, the pricing model was not great. It came out to, I think it was like a minimum of $900 a month. I hope that they took what Andres and I said with a little bit of seriousness, because you really only get the one shot when you debut something
Yeah.
to keep people from getting scared off. You have that initial, and then you can backtrack, but then you get all of the repercussions of backtracking publicly. It is what it is. So really, that one shot when it comes out, let's hope that it gets close to a serverless pricing model. Okay, James, last one, last clip. This is from the live coding session that I did with Michael Leando last week. The clip itself is actually about real-time notifications, which is what you and I were talking about at the beginning of this episode. And it's about the different types of pushes. So the session itself was about me making an emoji reaction Chrome extension where anybody could have this little website up on their phone, press an emoji, and it would display across my screen. So I was talking about what are your options when it comes to basically fetching that event. Let's listen in. So we're talking about real-time notifications. We're talking about getting data from the server. And what we usually think about is push notifications.
Yep.
I have a persistent connection from the client. In this case, it's the browser with the server side. And in this case, this is Momento. Whenever something happens, like a message is published, it passes it right down along that open connection.
Yeah.
It's like you're on the phone. Your other option, if you can't get a push from the server, is a pull. We'll talk with the short poll because this is what people think of when they think of polling is a request response. Do you have anything? No. Do you have anything? No. Do you have anything? Yes. And that goes on regular intervals. It could be every 5 seconds. It could be every minute. That answer 99 times out of 100 is no, I don't have anything. To get by that, you do long polling where the server will wait to respond until that answer is yes. If you look at my example here, do you have anything? Yes. I was hesitating on that clip because I know there are people that only listen to this podcast. In having that pause for so long, I think that was like a 2-second pause where I said, do you have anything? Yes. The dead air is hard to listen to. But yeah, those are the different types of real-time notifications that you can do at the fundamental level. You could go down a little bit lower and talk about the different protocols like you and I were doing, like MQTT, server sent events, WebSockets. But as far as like strategies go for getting information from the server to the clients, that's what you got.
And I think another kind of ancillary conversation is very quickly with this idea of real time, only because it brings to mind a conversation I once had with a customer who wanted real time notifications, and we actually dived a bit deeper into what they needed. And it was, yeah, as long as they know within an hour, Okay, so let's define real time. Yeah, exactly. Real time. Air quotes for anybody who's just listening. So I just think that's really important. Any of these conversations around real time, especially when you're making them decisions between maybe you need a whole bunch of other infrastructure to do proper real time push, when maybe if an hour is fine, back to what I was saying earlier about email, maybe if an hour is a fine timeline, then an email is a much simpler architectural choice than trying to set up a lot of stuff just to do real time push.
Yep. Yeah. Of course, with each option, there are trade-offs.
Yes.
We've been talking for a long time, so we don't have to talk about those trade-offs. I did talk about them in that video though. So if you are interested a little bit more about that, do go watch that video. It's pretty fun too. There's a lot of emojis on the screen pretty much the whole time. Makes it fun. Okay. So this coming week, let's try to wrap this one up quick, James. Pretty light on live streams. I think this is a rest week because we scrambled so hard to get 6 sessions in last week. We have 1 or 2 sessions, James. I say 1 or 2 because the first one you and I have talked about doing, but we haven't set any concrete plans yet. Working with Restate, is that what it is?
Michael Gash hit me with this when we were in Warsaw together. So yeah, it's a really cool distributed systems workflow engine thing. Temporal and step functions would be the closest comparison, I think, but better. Don't say that.
Different. Okay, if we can get our ducks in a row on that one, we will be doing that one live. And this, I would imagine it's going to be like what Andres and I do usually when we do coding sessions that are more or less assessments. It's honest first opinions. What's the DX? Can we get it to, or can we use it? Does it feel serverless? What's the pricing? Et cetera, et cetera. And then the for sure session that we have this week is with David Baruzzi on Friday. He's made a little game, an escape room style game with his application. And not like an application when I say I built something. He's building a real application called Speedrun that is actually very cool. I'll let him talk about it in his session, but he and Danielle are going to be doing an escape room style session. So I'm really curious. We haven't done anything like that before. So I'm curious to see how that's going to go.
Yeah.
And final thing, happy October, everybody. And with October, with the month change, brings the new theme of the month. And since Halloween is at the end of October, we are doing production horror stories. Have you deleted a database table in production? Have you dropped an event to a critical workflow and had no idea how to debug it? Tell us about it, please. It makes us feel less bad about doing it ourselves. And we do hearing the lessons learned and what the root cause analysis was and how you prevented it in the future. So it helps a little bit of everybody. We all get on the same page as each other. Doesn't have to be a huge thing. Just raise your hand. Tell us, what did you do? What did you learn? And what can others do to not delete that database table in production? So excited to see everything and get on the same page as everybody. I have some myself that I might share.
Yeah, agreed. And remember, this is a safe
And
space, everybody. If you do have something, we're all friends here. We've all been there. We've all done it. We've all deleted something. We've all been there. So if there's anything that comes to mind, it'd be awesome to hear from anybody who's got any kind of production horror stories, because we've all been there. We've all got.
That's right. Yes, I'm pretty sure my old chair at my desk in my last job had like sweat stains in it from me dropping things in production.
I didn't read that. I was in one of my very first jobs. I was a support, like frontline support, and I dropped an entire. When you go on a website and you've got product descriptions, product titles, product prices, I just dropped everything from the database. So the website just went blank immediately. And this was like 12 years ago. So database restores weren't quite clicking at the AWS console. So there's mine. Short form.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear more about that one. Yeah, the moral of the story, don't let frontline support have write access to your database.
That's it. There we go. We just done it.
There we go. Okay, last thing. If you're listening and you're not a part of the Discord, go ahead and sign up and come in. Help us get to that 1,000 number by the end of the year. We really appreciate that. You don't have to respond. You don't have to engage in the conversations, but it is very helpful for me just watching, being a fly on the wall and seeing all the conversations in there from real practitioners around the entire world. So go in there, believeinserverless.com/community will take you straight to the Discord. Feel free as well to follow the Believe in Serverless community on any social media that you can. We're on X, we're on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on Twitch. Believe in SLS. The reason it's Believe in SLS is because Believe in Serverless was too long for Twitter. And I was like, okay, SLS is short enough. We'll use that. And I think people know what that means. Also, 2 weeks ago, Andres and I built a dynamic RSS feed that shares links that you all share in the Discord community. So if you're interested in what people are talking about, but you don't want to go to Discord, you can absolutely follow that RSS feed in whatever feeder you use, and it will show with some context around what those links are. And it does filter out anything that's not relevant. So when I go and I share my Twitter profile, it says, no, I'm not sharing that with everybody that follows the feed. So if you do want to go and take a look at that, believeinserverless.com/RSS. All right, James, it's great seeing you, buddy. Great
Likewise.
talk.
Yeah. Catch up soon.
All right. Thank you again, everybody. And we will see you next week.